Okay, now, that's been a pretty rich discussion. Does it raise any questions? There you go.
Hi, my question is for the last speaker, Paul Thoppil. You say in July 2006, the AFN and the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs signed a memorandum of understanding to jointly review the fiscal relationship. When did the federal government start amalgamating, not amalgamating, but you said how everybody's represented at the table. I'm just wondering where AFN was brought in. Was that already set up and then you approached AFN, or were they in? It just seems to me it's important for everything that the Indigenous people be at the table in the beginning, even if it's just to say, okay, we're both going off doing our thing and then we'll meet again, you know?
That's a very good question. I think, to be very candid, there's always a bit of a legitimacy that the AFN has whenever it engages with some degree of policy or program reform with government that will have an impact on First Nation communities. I think we've seen that through the failed education bill. We've seen it through so many other attempts at the past. So there is a real social license issue that both government and the AFN needs to have in terms of a legitimacy to any work that's going on that will have an impact on First Nation communities. And I have apprised the AFN on so many occasions of the need for them to have a governance and to reach out to all First Nation communities to make them apprised, engaged, and contribute towards this agenda. And this forum is just one of many examples of trying to do so, but a more real conversation with First Nation communities will be have in the fall.
I got the mic. I got the next question, I guess. My name is John Paul. I'm with the Atlantic Policy Congress First Nation Chiefs. I was just trying to figure out, you presented a scenario where you're trying to get to one vision and you got two processes going on. How do you square that up to get to one place is what I'm trying to figure out.
Thank you very much for the question. That is, in a sense, the trick in all this, which is when you have two processes underway, trying to ensure coherence and integration is going to be important, right? And that's where dialogues that need to happen between both groups is going to be key for all that. So we are very much apprised of the challenges associated with what you've talked about, and we're trying to implement some risk mitigation processes and protocols to ensure that whatever comes out is coherent.
I think it is a bit complicated. And I see, you have self-governing First Nations communities and those under the Indian Act. So I guess I would say, where's the government wanting to achieve? I think at the end, the government always wants to achieve, as First Nations, to be in a self-governing position. So why aren't they going there? What's happening? Why isn't you need two processes, I think? Because I do worry about two processes. Like I'm not sure what that's going to create, but maybe it's so difficult to get First Nations under the Indian Act to move to self-government. You guys know that better than anybody. But why is that the case? I'd rather look at the underlying reasons why we can't. And I know it's been tried many times before, but we're in a bit of a different, this should be a different mindset. A government who's really wanting to, I think, change the relationship. So I think all these things should be open. And I do worry about keeping two tracks at the end of the day, and Paul doesn't have to defend all this. I've just got a view. Like what kind of partnership arrangements will that mean? I mean, if there was a certain governance structure out there with First Nations, this kind of conditionality, if you're a band that, or a First Nations community that has very little capacity. So you're still very much under the Indigenous affairs, you're very much under their watch versus, you know, others who have great capacity, well, they're more independent. Well, maybe it's up to First Nations governance to at a certain level, if you had tribal councils or whatever, determining how those communities should be dealt with within their domain, as opposed to the government always kind of laying out all the conditions for those. But I mean, we have to start at a certain place. I would hope at one point there's one transfer arrangement for all, with some requiring some special assistance to kind of move them there. But I worry when we see two different kind of regimes being developed.
Harold, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think it's, if you want to ask yourself why are there two processes, you just need to look at the BC treaty making process. 23 years.
Well, I have a view on that too.
Four treaties.
Yeah.
First Nation communities are not buying into the mandates that are being given to Paul and others.
All right.
You know, I mean, Paul and I agreed that I'd love a treaty, I'd love a self-government agreement, but not under the terms that they're proposing. And so where does the government come down and start having a frank conversation about the failure of these processes and putting the source at the mandates that are there? I mean, it's, I think, you know, I worry about a self-government process that goes down the same treaty process, 23 years and no agreements.
I agree.
So I think that we have to get some frank conversation on things like portability of rights, taxation, tax exemption, whether or not self-government and fiscal financing arrangements are within treaties instead of being bilateral agreements outside of the treaty. Because in my view, part of the consideration I'm giving if Squamish signs a treaty is that I have a fiscal financing relationship that's covered by the treaty. I have a self-government agreement that's covered by the treaty. Because I saw what happened in Ishka. 5 years after their fiscal financing agreement had expired, they still didn't have a new one. And they were operating on the last year's funding agreement. So, if you got me going now, so I'll stop.
You're saying that it would also be helpful to look at what some of the barriers First Nations are keeping First Nations from self-government arrangements, is basically your argument?
Well, and you look at what the offers are. You look at what the consequences have been as a result of Supreme Court decisions on consultation and accommodation. It doesn't make economic sense. As the Nishka told Kitselis the other day, it's a spreadsheet exercise now.
Okay, so I think we've got one more question or a couple of
Yeah.
questions.
When you're asking a question, thank you, John Paul, because if you do, just identify who you are and what organization you're from. It helps us, because I don't know everybody here, and I'd really like to know who's asking the question. But coming back to the 2%, Wayne, 1998, I'm Peter Garrow, Mohawk to Wakwazasing. You hear? But the lights didn't go out, though, that when I just said that. Wayne, I was around, of course, when the 2% cap was put on. And it's supposed to be done every 5 years. And then I just heard that even with the Nishka, every 5 years.
Yeah.
It's, how do you keep those? In fact, and I was involved, of course, with Scott on the colonial accord.
Yeah.
And that, you know, which failed. There's a level of mistrust in all of this, and I really appreciate, Paul, what you're trying to do with setting up all of these other institutions that will capture it. But the Indian Act is still there. And that's a major, major colonial piece that has to be gone somehow. 1969 tried it, but there has to be a new relationship. So maybe what happened, maybe it comes back to Wayne, that 2%. Why didn't it change after 5 years review?
I was afraid somebody was going to ask me that question. You
No,
know,
but,
I think if you go through the cycle, so you got to 96, 97, where the 2% now is reinforced. The deficit reduction exercise was like a 3-year to 97, and then you're into some surplus periods Which, you know, at that point, there was a lot of programming was kind of stabilized, right? Everybody took their hit, departments were stabilized 3-4 years. So you're close to down to the mid-2000s, and then there's a government change. And again, there's maybe a bit of re-education. You've got a number of years gone by. No, we're not going to touch the 2%. You know, financial accountability on First Nations is important. All this other stuff, and it kind of that lingers. And then we hit the financial crisis, and 5 years of deficit reduction again. And you know, even though the numbers clearly are there to show there's a huge deficiency, governments in a deficit reduction sometimes make decisions that, even though recognizing that deficiency is there, they're saying, we're just not going to spend the money. Because you know what the most important objective is? Is to get the deficit back down to zero after, you know, ramping it up to about $40 billion. So it kind of got caught up in different cycles, I think. If I, you know, no one's ever gone back and done a study of this, but I look at the scenario unfold. Everybody thought it was a great, you know, the 2% 95 to 2000 was kind of a big win that it stayed there. And then it was kind of stabilized as we went along, and then we began a government change, which I think really did kind of reset the agenda again. They had certain views, as you know. And then the financial crisis, and that's taken us today. I mean, it seems like a long time. When you break it up in those cycles, you kind of see the argument, even though there were those in the system who very much argued strongly that there needed to be a rebasing, particularly the officials in the Department of Indian Affairs, Indigenous Affairs. I mean, they carried that case, I thought, very strongly many times to say that we need to rebase.
Howard wants to get into this, but Peter, I'll just correct you. As the deputy minister that had to sell this to First Nations, our commitment was not related to 5 years. Our commitment was 2% until the deficit is defeated, at which time we will sit down and negotiate a fair rate of growth. So it really became a problem when Prime Minister Martin sat down with the provinces and gave them all kinds of growth, 3% and 6% on health, at which time Phil Fontaine and I said, hey, what about First Nations? And Mr. Martin has since admitted that he should have just gone to a fair rate of growth then. That was the time. But of course, he wanted Kelowna. He wanted Kelowna, and he wanted to get at this issue of efficiency of service delivery and quality of service delivery. And of course, that was
the end of the deficit reduction period. At the end was when Martin became the Prime Minister, and he had Kelowna and other ways to look at that funding. And then that all went out the window when the Harper government came along.
Howard, you wanted to get in quickly.
Yeah, as well too. That I'll give you two examples of how simple math always affects things that are going to happen. In 1985, C-31 came along. The government set aside, under Mulroney, quote unquote, said, no First Nation shall suffer. So 500 million was set aside. Year one take up, 0, because they were still trying to figure out what was C-31 and who was eligible. Year 2, 0 take up. By year 3, they finally had all of the papers in order for the introduction of people coming back into the community, so 10%. Year 4, about 30%, and year 5, about 50%. So 410 million went back into the Consolidated Revenue Fund. And that money was never replaced, and over time, A-base became a reality. But you look at that as one example. Secondly, remember back in the 80s, there was a march on the Hill with, for post-secondary students. And they're saying there's not enough money. At that particular time, Indian Affairs returned probably about $70 million on post-secondary because First Nations who had received that money didn't have the capacity to engage and have their students go, so they held on to that money until such time that they couldn't spend it. So that went back to the CRF as well. So when you look at those kinds of things, and when we talk about understanding financial statements and financial responsibilities, we have to look at it from a two-way perspective as well, because with Wayne sitting way up top here, his bureaucrats down here are reviewing and analyzing and making recommendations saying they don't need it. Treasury Board pressed a button, I'm exaggerating a bit, but it came out $12 billion were going to Indians. Not true, because $4 billion of those dollars were funds that were for land claims and payments that were owed because of court cases. And of the other $8 million, about $3 million was returned to CRF because all federal departments didn't use that money. They identified it, and they said, we have $1 million to go to Aboriginal for consultation, but never used those monies. So those are clear examples in regards to First Nations understanding more and more about what the financial situation is, as opposed to just bottom lining and saying, I received X amount and I spent X amount.
Okay, so we have one more question, but I want to, Paul, your colleagues on the panel have been commenting. Does it raise any, I don't want to cut you off from an opportunity. Did you hear anything that bothered you? You're okay?
No, because there's the whole purpose of this engagement process is to hear views and to make sure that we take those views into account to make sure that whatever is developed reflects what they want, right? This is not a top-down process like they did in the past. The minister and the government has made it very clear that any new policy that ever gets developed under this government only gets developed in terms of a process that is co-developed with Indigenous peoples themselves. And that is their journey that we're on right now.
So one takeaway is we're all a little bit nervous about these two tracks, but anyway.
And on that, I should say that there is a fourth working group under the AFN process to do the integration between the two processes. Okay. There you go.
I guess it's not really a question, but you can feel free to address it. I'm Marcia Nickerson, and I actually wrote the dialogue paper, and I write the summaries that come out of this, so a little bit of maybe context is useful. I think the AFN definitely has a role to play in all of this, but the AFN is not a nation. Mm-hmm. So when the fall comes, I don't know how much time you have to roll this out to the actual nations who are going to be speaking to it, but to me, that's where the nation-to-nation dialogue exists, and that's where we've had huge problems in the past, like around the education piece and others. So I don't know if that's like, I love your enthusiasm, but it really worries me because that's not the foundation of what I hear communities and nations wanting to deal with, or how they want to deal on a nation-to-nation basis.
Howard, one quick comment?
Yeah, I like your comment because we in British Columbia have signed a resolution, and a letter was sent to the national chief that we needed a seat at the table from a British Columbia perspective. And fortunately or unfortunately, we are different west of the Rockies. And our issues are more advanced, I would say, at this point in time. So I agree with you.
So our time is up. I think you'll agree with me, I hope you'll agree with me that that was a good, rich discussion, and I want to thank our panelists one more time, please.